Hi, everyone. This is Tanya.
And this is Adriana.
We are back with Closing the Gap, a social justice podcast where we talk about different ways that we can approach social justice. We could talk about solutions and how to heal individually and collectively. Today, we have a really great guest, our first international guest, Heizal Patricia Nagginda of Uganda. I am so excited to hear. This is amazing. And it's a great way to end our season, actually. You're going to be our last interview this season, Heizal. So I am just excited that we are like shining this light on you because you deserve it all. And so, just so everyone knows who Heizal is based in Uganda, and I met her through Instagram. I was looking for places to, in case you don't know, I'm a writer. So I was looking for places to write articles for. And so Heizal has a great platform called Climate Operation, which we'll talk about, all about climate justice, which we'll also talk about. And so I reached out to her, and from there, we got an interview and an article, which we can show in the show notes. But yeah, since then, we've really connected, and everything that Hazel's doing in Uganda is, I mean, it applies to all over the world because, of course, the climate crisis is affecting us all, some more than others, but still affecting us all. So, yes, Heizal, thank you for coming on. Thank you for just telling us all about the amazing work that you're doing. I first want to start off with what got you into this. What does climate justice mean to you? Because this term can be maybe confusing for a lot of people. How does the climate crisis and social justice connect for you? And yeah, feel free to add anything else to your introduction. I'm sure you have a lot more to say.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Tanya, Adriana. This is really cool. And yeah, to introduce myself, I'm Hazel. Yes, I'm from Uganda and the founder of Climate Operation. And basically, the work that we do at Climate Operation is educate young people. Of course, now I'm starting to realize that young people, it becomes a little bit exclusionary. So we are now trying to see that we educate people about the climate crisis in very accessible and relatable ways. And to answer your question, what does climate justice mean to me? I mean, for me, and this is a very biased answer, for me, climate justice is more accessible and relatable climate education for all because currently the information at the moment about the climate crisis is very scientific. And that makes it very unrelatable and kind of like unnerving for people to actually get involved in climate action. We have seen this, like, for example, with the Ugandan youth that we have worked with, whereby because the information is either not accessible, whereby they do not have access to internet because most of it is on the internet, or it's really scientific to a point whereby they just don't see how they could actually add anything to it. They just don't feel empowered to get involved with climate action. So, in a perfect world, for me, I think climate justice would mean making climate education or just generally climate information more accessible and relatable. And of course, this can come in so many forms. Like, for example, at Climate Operation, what we have done, and I know this is obviously not like a one solution fits all, we created a climate education directory. And of course, it's on the internet, yes. But what we did is we broke down the climate crisis in like parts. So it makes it less confusing for someone to know where to start from. So that could be a way in which you make climate education much more accessible and relatable. Another way, and for us, it has worked, and I think this can work for very many grassroots organizations, is instead of, for example, like if you don't have climate education materials, is to actually just have spaces where young people come and share their experiences around how they have been impacted by the climate crisis and ideate solutions on how they can actually start to join into climate action. So for me, in a perfect world, that would what climate justice would look like.
Love that. Totally agree.
And it sounds like you kind of answered the reason why you were inspired to start Climate Operation, but can you elaborate a little bit more if there's like a specific instance or a specific reason why you started Climate Operation and how it's progressed to what it is currently?
Yeah. So basically, before I started climate operation, I was actually still at law school and I was taking this module in law school called oil and gas policy. It's ironic. I was taking oil and gas policy at the same time I was taking environmental law. So it was a very interesting kind of like mix and match because fossil fuels are damaging the environment, but then I was also taking environmental law. So I think from the knowledge of my oil and gas policy course and just realizing how, like, for example, the global north is phasing out fossil fuels while actually investing in fossil fuels in the global south, I then started to actually ask myself, is the climate crisis going to like impact us differently? And that is when I actually started doing my research. And that is when I started asking questions like to my peers of, do you guys know that this is happening? And the thing that shocked me the most was one, most did not know. And then the ones that knew just did not care because to them, they believed that climate change was not, for example, a Ugandan problem, right? The idea that most young people in my country think about when they think of climate change, one is weather, which is not wrong. But then the second thing is they believe it's a very white problem because of how it has been messaged. And I think right now it's being messaged differently. But before that, what we would think about climate change would be polar bears dying, ice caps melting. So to me, that was a problem because if that is the message that young people, and for especially young people in a continent that is currently at the brunt of the climate crisis, believed climate change was, then it would take us years to actually start to solve the climate crisis. And since we are at the brunt of it, we need climate solutions now. So I think that is when I decided to just form Climate Operation with this idea that let's create a platform, a space that starts to educate young people about the climate crisis in ways that are relatable to them and just make that information more accessible, create spaces, bring out, like, for example, how we interviewed Tanya, amplify voices from different perspectives so that they get to realize that, oh no, this is not just ice caps melting and polar bears dying, it's more broad, it's bigger. So that was the whole vision behind Climate Operation.
I love that. I agree. That's a huge problem that we have. And I think it's because of what you mentioned before, that a lot of the information is scientific. And so the people that are translating that scientific information maybe miss out a lot of parts. And it is difficult. Like, I don't like reading those reports either. I read the synopsis, I read the short articles, not the 700 pages that like these theses are. That's just not accessible. So yeah, there's a lot of like just miscommunication there. And then between the news and the people, it's like just each step, there's going to be more miscommunication again and again. But I did want to emphasize something you said. You said that as the African continent is in the brunt of the climate crisis. And I don't think everyone knows why or how. So can you just elaborate on that? Like, why are you seeing, or what are you seeing happening to your communities, either in Uganda or across Africa, that relate to the climate crisis, but are more than like weather, as you mentioned?
Okay, so that is a very interesting question because last year we have been working on the Envisioning Environmental Equity Project. So this was a collaboration between University of Sao Paulo, the University College London with Western Health and YACAP. And basically what we're trying to do was educate young people about the intersection of climate, health, and inequalities. And of course, for us, this gave us the opportunity to really like go into communities that have been hard hit by the climate crisis. And really also for me, it was a learning opportunity for me to see how climate and health intersect. And one of the impacts that I saw was the health impact that arising from the climate crisis. So I'll just give you an example from Uganda. So in Uganda, we have people, the urban poor. So the urban poor live in slums, right? And these slums are usually in valleys, they are densely populated, and generally it's majority women and children that live in these areas. So in cases whereby there are floods, the valleys are the ones that are actually hit the most. And because of this, the physical health impacts like diarrhea, dysentery, so basically waterborne diseases are really high. And of course, the thing that makes this worse, which as we always say that the climate crisis just amplifies other inequalities, is because in Uganda, we do have free healthcare, but I would say that free healthcare is like, it's free healthcare in quotes. So these people, to be honest, cannot afford to actually treat themselves against this thing that they did not cause, which just amplifies that inequality. That's one of the, can I say, physical health impacts. Then another physical health impacts, now this one goes away from the urban poor onto the farming communities. So in Uganda, I would say more than half of the country relies on agriculture for sustenance, for, can I say, for money. And then again, majority of the farmers in my country are women. So because of the changing weather patterns, and I know we're talking about weather here, but because of the changing weather patterns, so this has really destabilized the way in which these farmers actually grow and harvest. And it has just amplified yet again the food insecurity in the country. And because these women are now not only the breadwinners for their families, but they also now have to feed, their children, this is just again amplifying physical health impacts such as malnutrition. And as always, the underlying yet very important health impact or the negative mental health impacts that are arising from this. So when we were in these communities, something they talked about was how they are really showing signs of depression, of post-traumatic stress, of anxiety, all arising from these impacts. And the fact that now I lost my home, I lost my garden, I'm sick, I cannot afford healthcare. What am I going to do? I'm just stressed out. So all of these are the impacts of the climate crisis that people do not realize are actually happening. So it basically goes outside of weather. And I think that is why, for me, I always tell people that the moment you intersect climate change to other inequalities is when you realize that it is impacting us way more than just weather. It's impacting people's health, it's impacting people's livelihoods, it's impacting people's right to education. It, to a point, is also very distributed unfairly when it comes to gender. So those are all kind of like, can I say, the ways in which it intersects and starts to affect people in the global south.
That's a really important call out that you're bringing up. Because even myself personally, I don't really have that same kind of background as Tanya does with climate justice. I do research here and there, but I wouldn't be aware of these types of things. So I do appreciate you calling out the importance of awareness. I know you mentioned it earlier how you are currently working with other global orgs. How has that contributed to your work? Because would you say that it has helped in gaining awareness for these issues that aren't necessarily as widespread as they should be?
I think, yes, it really has. Okay, so in essence, collaboration for us at Climate Operation has been very important because, again, something that we realize is that with the climate crisis, we cannot work in silos, right? So basically, just collaborating and chatting with like-minded individuals, like-minded organizations, like-minded institutions, and just trying to see how can we work together and just, achieve, as we say, climate justice. So for us at Climate Operation, like for example, with the envisioning environmental equity that I was talking about, we did not just explore the intersection between climate health and, for example, other inequalities, but we also tried to see how best can we involve young people in climate action. And that's when we started to explore artistic ways, which for me was very new. It was a learning experience because I honestly thought like climate education is like climate curriculums. So how can we, engage young people? And most of them were very keen on like artistic ways. So that is when we started to involve them in comic making and filmmaking. And we realized that it was not only like a medium for them to like talk about their experiences with the climate crisis, but it was also a way to amplify their voices. Because when we took these comics and these films outside of Uganda and for example, showed them at COP27, that is when people are like, okay, so this is happening. How can we support you? Or how can we like join in on the movement? So that is one of the ways, yes, that it was really important for collaborations because they, yes, do amplify the voices of those that I would not say are voiceless, but the ones that just don't have the opportunity to be in certain spaces. So yes, collaborations do actually amplify and they do play a very critical role. And I think that is why for me, going forward, and I believe everyone going forward, just kind of like collaborating with people and having that community of people that you can work with, because it's always a learning process. Because for me, when I was joining this climate space, to be honest, I was not an environmentalist. I was a law student. So I really did not know much. So kind of just working with people that have experience and do have the knowledge has been a really growing process for us. And I think that is how climate operation has been able to grow to what it is now.
I feel like I want to emphasize everything you're saying, but I'll just point out a few things that stood out to me because, like I said, I feel like a lot of people don't use these terms as often as maybe I do in daily language, climate justice, all these things mean. And so when you said these people aren't voiceless, they just aren't getting their voices heard, that's super important, I think, to emphasize because, especially with the African continent, I mean, we're talking about people that are used in photos so that people here and in the US can donate to, oh, well, yes, we have to feed the people in Africa, as if like it's just one blanket Africa, when it's obviously all these different cultures, all these different people, all these different groups experiencing different things. But like you said, the whole continent is experiencing in one way or another the brunt of the climate crisis. And that is something that we really have to address as us in the global north, because the African continent just as a whole has not contributed to greenhouse gas emissions as much as people and corporations and governments in the US and Europe and the global north have. And so having that in mind, it's a global inequality in that sense between different, global powers, but also you can hone down into cities, right? Like even we live here in near Los Angeles. So in Los Angeles, we have areas where there are people experiencing more of the climate crisis than like others with, air conditioning, and they don't have to worry about heat waves, things like that. So I want to say, like, for everyone listening, like, yes, we're talking on a global scale right now, but this can happen in any other region. Like, just these inequalities that we see anywhere, no matter where they are, no matter who's experiencing them. The climate crisis, like Heizal said, just multiplies that. So every inequality we had before that was set up before because of the systems we have in place, like intentionally set up, it's just getting multiplied now. But with all of that said, like I already mentioned, we as the Global North really have to support people like you in the Global South and amplify your voices.
To clarify what I mean by Global North and Global South, first of all, I use these terms because they're the best I've seen so far. I'm not saying they're perfect. Language is always evolving. And they're the best I've seen when it comes to referring to countries that are wealthier on a global scale and have more resources compared to countries that tend to have more poverty. And this is not coincidental, right? We know that countries in the global north, such as the US and European nations, the reason they have all that wealth is because they have actively extracted it and continue to extract it from countries in the global south, consisting of the African continent and Latin America and other places. And so these terms are used to kind of replace what tends to be used, which is third world countries. And the term third world is really meant to identify countries as lesser than because they have more poverty or they have more economic issues, supposedly. But we know here in the US that we have plenty of economic instability and plenty of poverty as well. So this term, third world, pointing fingers at certain countries when we have the same problems is not only wrong to look at certain countries as lesser than, but also it's not factual. We have plenty of problems here as well. And the other term that's used is developed versus underdeveloped. So third world versus first world, developed versus underdeveloped, and then global south and global north. And underdeveloped is really just what it means. These countries don't have the same infrastructure as the US. They don't have the same everything else that comes with that. So to look at countries that don't have these same resources, again, because they were actively extracted from them, and again, deem them as lesser than or less worthy, really misses the point. Just because we have certain infrastructure in the US doesn't mean we're a better country. Look at all the issues that we have to address right now and fast. Look at all the people that are being harmed in the process in our countries and worldwide because of these issues. So these terms really are becoming outdated, and Global North and Global South have become the best terms that I've seen and the most recent ones. But I know they are receiving criticism as well.
So what can we do, I guess, other than interview you, but people who don't have a podcast to interview, what are other ways that can just amplify your work, the work of everyone that you are working with as well? You already mentioned collaboration. I think that's an important one, but what else comes to mind for you?
I think for me, what comes to mind when it comes to like how people in the, as you said, the global north can support the work of people from the global south. Also, one of the ways, yes, like for example, when it comes to amplifying, I think sometimes people think amplifying is like this big thing, right? But it's really not. For one, you can amplify through social media, and like in the world we live, I would say some people have like at least one social media platform. That would be one of the ways to amplify. And also amplifying does not even have to mean social media. It can just mean like talking about these things with your friends or with your communities, because I do know that when it comes to the climate crisis, it's a very can I say, emotional topic to certain people, especially with people that, for example, maybe have faced the impacts of the climate crisis, or with people that believe that it does not exist. So having these uncomfortable conversations for me is another way in which, you can create that platform within, like, for example, your circle of friends or in your communities about what's happening in the world, kind of like taking them out of their echo chambers to realize that, oh, it's not just me, this is happening everywhere. And, the impacts are felt unequally. Then another way for me, I think, is volunteering, because very many grassroots organizations do need help. And if you could lend your expertise in whatever way that you want to these organizations, is another way in which you could help them, or can I say, support their work. That would also be another way. And I think for me, when it comes to all of this, the best way in which someone can support, can I say, organizations in the global south would be to first educate themselves, because it's from education that then you can actually just know how best can I contribute, because the climate crisis as is huge. It's impacting so much and its intersection is so much. So you kind of just educating yourself first, and then you asking yourself, how best can I contribute? How best can I use the skills that I have now to actually make an impact? Then that will address how you can start. So I think for starters, one would have to kind of like just educate themselves on the climate crisis and how it's intersected. And then that is when they'll choose what they would want to do. And there's so much to do.
Oh, yeah. And they will continue to be at the rate that we're going.
Well, I do feel like once people are educated, you do get motivated to take action because you realize the effects that are really taking place and how it, like to your point, it affects all of us. And it does benefit people to care about these things. I guess to kind of piggyback off of that, as you mentioned, Hazel, how there are people who climate justice and the climate crisis as a whole is a little bit of an emotional topic. For those who don't identify as environmentalists, why should they care about the climate crisis?
Yes. So as I said earlier, for me, as before I formed Climate Operation, I would say I was not an environmentalist as well, right? But it's literally seeing a problem in my community there with my peers that I realized that, oh, this needs answers. This is something that needs to be fixed. So for people who would not call themselves environmentalists, but I would say to a point in the world that we are living right now, the impacts of the climate crisis are being felt across the board. So it's now just not the environment, but they're being felt, like, for example, when it comes to like poverty, to gender, to race. So they're being felt across the board. So to someone who, okay, not that does not believe in climate change, but is not an environmentalist, I would say that if at all you are passionate about any other, social causes, then you should be passionate about climate change, because all those social causes and all those inequalities are actually exacerbated or are just amplified with the climate crisis. And therefore, a climate lens or an environmental lens needs to be added when we're trying to solve those other inequalities. So I think that is why we should care. And this goes back, I think, to what I was saying to a certain peer of mine. I was telling them that, for example, when it comes to policymakers in Uganda, the reason why most of them might not be very passionate about solving climate change is because they're looking at it as just climate change. But the moment we start looking at climate change, like, for example, with how it's amplifying negative health impacts, how it's amplifying gender inequalities, how it's amplifying lack of access to education, lack of access to basic needs, is when suddenly they'll realize that everything to a point right now needs to have an environmental lens. So I think that is what I would tell those people, that just look at all the inequalities in the world, or not even in the world, but in your community. And to a point right now where we're living, the climate crisis is amplifying those inequalities, and that is why you should care.
Yeah, there's no social justice without climate justice. I mean, if we think about it, like, how can there be? Because if you don't have access to healthy food, to clean air, to clean water, like, it doesn't matter if every other issue is fixed. We need that to survive. And so
Indeed.
I don't know. To me, I guess it feels obvious. Like, it really just comes down to survival at this point. Like Heizal mentioned, with the farmers in your area not being able to have a livelihood because your garden is wiped out in one day. Like, that's not something that should keep happening, especially now. It's happening like every year. It's going to keep just getting worse. And so, yeah, to not take action is to kind of just turn away from all the things that are already happening. Like, it's already here. And I actually think it's more powerful if you take action when you're not an environmentalist. And I say this as a self-identified environmentalist, but I think it's because when people look at me, like, I have my career going in this, and so people are like, oh, well, I have to be like her, like, she's doing, like, this is her career, this is her life, but I don't want to be all that, and so I can't do anything. And so when people look at people like me that, kind of, yeah, just give all their time to this and give their energy to this cause, it can feel almost intimidating. And I don't want people to feel that way, because it can be the smallest action. Like, I don't care if you're in Wall Street. I don't care if you're a corporate CEO, do something wherever you are. And I know I speak out against corporations all the time, but at the end of the day, we all need to take action no matter where we are. So if you can do whatever you can, whatever influence you have, I don't care if you call yourself environmentalist or not, like take that action and start small and then just work your way up. I don't care if you ever identify as environmentalist because yeah, I'm sure you'll inspire others that way as well. So that's perfectly fine with me.
Yeah, and just to kind of build off of that, I totally resonate. I wouldn't say I have too much of a background in climate justice, but it could be the simple act of educating yourself. And that's something that your organization, Hazel, is doing so well, is providing these tools for people like me who don't necessarily know where to start. To our listeners, I really encourage that you please check out our show notes so that you can see where their website is. They even have an education directory that I thought was so cool. It literally lays out all of these resources, definitions, it's like handing it to you. Like the education, you don't even have to do the research. Climate operation is literally handing you this information. So I strongly encourage our listeners to click those links and educate yourself.
There's no excuse now. We're all literally handing it to you, so get to work. And that reminds me of this resource by Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. She's a marine biologist, climate activist, just amazing person, human being. She created this resource that's a Venn diagram. And there's 3 questions for your skills, passions, communities. And the point is that in the middle, you come up with your climate role, how you can take action specifically. And it's cool because no matter what you're into, there's a role for you. There's a space for you. If you're into graphic design, that's awesome. We need to spread awareness some way and in a visually appealing way so people are interested, right? So no matter what you're into, you can get involved. Again, we all need to take a part.
Just, I guess, to kind of bring this to an end, is there any final call outs or thoughts that you wanted to share, Hazel?
I mean, you guys literally just summarized my final thoughts. But I think final thoughts are like you, Adriana, and Tanya as well. The climate crisis can be a bit overwhelming, right? And like the journey to climate action can be overwhelming. But for me, I think one, if you educate yourself and kind of just know what you can contribute, the Venn diagram you talked about really helpful because it kind of just like lays out your strengths and it's like, yeah, this is what you can do. I think if someone takes their time just exploring, and just seeing where they can use their skills the most, that is when they can actually do something. And of course, when we say do something, we don't mean you need to do everything because, again, you do not want to overwhelm yourself. But just doing something is like playing a role against fighting climate change. So I think for me, a final call to action would be start some, and you don't need to start a lot, just do the tiniest of things and then just go from there, see where this takes you. If you feel inspired, you could start maybe your own Instagram that can turn into a company like what we did with climate operation. And yeah, just have fun doing it because again, the more you go into this work is when you realize that yes, it can be overwhelming, but then just seeing the impact that it's having on communities can also be very fulfilling and fun. So that is what I would say.
No, that's super important because this is not something that we get done in one day, right? This is a very huge crisis that it's affecting everyone. And honestly, it's probably going to be for life for our generation. And so it has to be something that you really love doing, because if not, if you only last, a few months, thank you for your help, but we're going to need more than that. So yeah, I do think we all need to emphasize this is something that can be joyful as well, coming in community. The comic books that you're doing are really cool. Ideas like that, you kind of bring whatever skills and passions you have, it'll turn out into something amazing and you may not even know where it'll lead. And that's all the more incredible and just exciting. Thank you again, Hazel, for everything that you're doing, for taking the time with us today. So everyone knows, Heizal woke up early to be with us today because we're on different sides of the world, so our time zones do not line up. So thank you again so much. We just love what you're doing. We're glad we can amplify it, like you said, in a small way, but I hope that it helps you and just inspires you and inspires others to join your work.
I mean, thank you so much again, for creating the time, because I know as well for you it's quite late. So thank you for staying up this late as well. And I hope that everyone that listens to it maybe learned something, and it helps them on their journey to climate action, because that is what we want. We want climate justice. So I hope this podcast is very fulfilling to someone that listens to it when it's released.
We hope you all enjoyed this episode. Please follow us on whatever streaming platform you use. To learn more, you can follow us on Instagram at closingthegappod or email us at closingthegappod@gmail.com with questions and feedback. Thanks for listening. Until next time.